Hello, Mr. Matthew McKenna. Are you there?
Hi, David. Good afternoon. Going to share my slides, and let's make sure that the slides are presenting themselves accordingly now. Let me know when you can see my screen. You're on mute, David. Just want to get a
One mistake is enough for today, so
yeah. Just
the
want to make
bet is on me.
okay. Just want to make sure I'm going to put it into presenter mode and just make sure that I have it showing in the right place. Do you see my presenter mode, or do you see the display?
We have full screen on it.
You have full screen. Perfect. Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody, regardless of what time zone you may be sitting in, whether you're in APAC, EMEA, or North America. My name is Matthew McKenna. I'm the president of international operations at SecurityScorecard. First thing I wanted to share is healthcare is a very personal area when it comes to my family. If I think of my family members, my mother worked in healthcare for 25 years. She was an office manager for multiple medical facilities. And the thing that impressed me the most about her is she was still working in healthcare at the time when computers were just coming into play. And I've never seen a person who knew the insurance space of the US healthcare system inside out in such an impressive way. My brother has been an executive in the pharmaceutical sector also for over a decade and is also very close with this space. So discussions around healthcare have been common within my family. So I'm going to cover a couple of areas today, and we have about 30 minutes, and I'm going to try to make this extremely relevant for what has been shown in today's world. I think it's almost impossible now to talk about healthcare and the dynamics of the changes within healthcare without mentioning COVID. I think we probably all have heard enough of the word COVID for a lifetime, but COVID has in fact transformed third-party cyber risk massively in healthcare, and that's due to the way the industry has had to shift itself over the last year. So that's going to be one topic that I'm going to cover. The second area that I'm going to focus in on is I really want to give you some insights as to what we're seeing as a security ratings provider into what are commonalities among breach companies in the healthcare sector. So I'm going to take you through a study which compares the healthcare sector to finance and retail sectors, as well as overall breaches, which we monitored over 2020. And we'll see some really interesting things in this area. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, how do we apply things like security ratings and how do we reduce risk of our evolving ecosystems? So what's been extremely interesting is, let's say when COVID came to us at the beginning of last year, one of the first things that we saw was social engineering issues and phishing issues skyrocketed. And what's funny is that the phishing and the social engineering attacks that have been taking place have worked in a very similar way to the virus itself. Just like the coronavirus, we see social engineering and phishing type of attacks are related to how closely our online communities are connected. In most cases, many people have just shown mild to moderate symptoms. However, as David mentioned, sometimes those malicious actors are inside our networks for over 100 days before we even know that they're there. I think the third commonality is no one is immune yet to the COVID virus. We're on our movements with vaccines. It's getting better towards a herd immunity, but there's that same thing when it came to social engineering is no one's really immune to it. And the fourth piece is that those that had prior health conditions often fared worse with COVID. It's the same thing when we look at our enterprises or we look at our own supply chain, is that when the cyber healthcare or the cyber hygiene of those organizations is not in good shape, they're more susceptible to a poor outcome as a result of these. And then finally, of course, is personal hygiene. We've been told to wash our hands incessantly for the last year. It's very similar, is when we keep good cyber hygiene of our organizations, we reduce the risk of infection. The same time, what we've been seeing is there's been a rapid transformation, right? We've moved over into remote work. There's been new sectors in the healthcare industry, which I'll talk about in a moment, which have skyrocketed as a result of people not being mobile anymore. This has resulted into a couple of things, is that as we've shifted our infrastructures, we've moved to remote working, we've seen a lot more misconfiguration errors due to the speed at which we're working. This has made it a lot easier for malicious actors to gain access into our supply chain and move laterally. And I think the big learning, what we're seeing as a result of this epidemic, is that our IT infrastructure going forward is going to be more robust. It's going to be agile, elastic, and hardened in terms of its security, as well as automated from the beginning. So these are really the three takeaways, what we've seen at scale happening over the last month. Now, what's also been noticed is that innovation is rewarded when it comes to times of crisis. You see on the left side, there's a nice little map here from McKinsey, is that those organizations that decided to innovate during times of crisis outperform their peers. Now, we've seen a couple of really good examples of this, like telehealth is one. We've seen IoT take off with remote care. A great example of this is Sheba Medical Center in Israel is working with TytoCare, and they have a stethoscope which allows you to send back those images of the heart and lungs in real time and be able to provide guidance on what should be done. We've seen companies like Zipline, which have been using drones to move supplies into remote areas effectively. So distribution innovation has adjusted. Social media has also transformed with COVID in the way that we're communicating to our patients. We've seen the healthcare industry double down in this space to reach its patients more effectively. So really a lot of changes going on here, and supply chain adaptation is one of these where there's been a lot of investments and which will return high yields with that investment. Now, the flip side of all this dynamicism is that the healthcare industry has become an even higher target. You can see all the headlines on the side of the left. I think the biggest takeaways from all these headlines is that there were 26.1 million healthcare records breached in the United States last year in 2020. Of those 26.1 healthcare records, 24 million of those were breached as a result of a cyber attack. Now, if we extrapolate this on to our own organizations, and if we look at our vendor landscape, we see that 25% of those healthcare breaches were the result of a third party. And 54% of healthcare vendors themselves have also experienced a data breach within the last 5 years. So it is quite prevalent within the industry that these type of attacks are going to occur, and they're going to continue to keep pace as we transform as a industry. Now, the price of healthcare is that protected health information, or that PHI. And it's really amazing is that I look for a lot of visuals trying to map out the supply chain of healthcare, and the complexities are enormous. So I saw one that really caught my eye that I thought was really simple and nice, is that you can break healthcare into services, products, and finance. And I thought that was really nice. And those are basically the core pillars. And on the bottom, the targets of what we're seeing, we see already that that protected healthcare information is really what is the prize of malicious actors, but we're also seeing attacks in the industry looking for IPR. We saw this when organizations were working on vaccines. There were attacks looking for information about those vaccines. We're also seeing disruption in terms of supply chain disruption. Now, on the right side of this picture, you see the Twitter logo, you see the Facebook logo, and then you see something really small there. Well, the one at the top is an actor named Kevin Bacon, and I'm not sure if you've ever followed this, but there's a parlor game called the 6 Degrees of Separation to Kevin Bacon, which basically means that you can connect any actor to Kevin Bacon within 6 steps anywhere in the world. Now, if we look at the connection of Twitter around the world, that degree of separation goes down to 4.7. Facebook, it drops down to 3.5. If we look to our global supply chain, that degree of separation goes down to under 3. So we are more closely connected than ever. We also see a great reliability of over 30% of our global supply chain has impacts or connections into China. So there's also a lot of reliance, with North America being highly reliant, Europe being less reliant, and Australia being highly reliant. So this indicates for us is that connectivity between attacks, between incidents, is going to get tighter and tighter, because that lateral movement across the supply chain is becoming easier and shorter along the way. So now what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to demonstrate this to you. So we have run a study of commonalities of findings among breach companies within the healthcare sector. And so we used a little bit of external studies. We used some of our SecurityScorecard data to provide some insights on this. Now, the first thing that we saw when the pandemic started was a very similar growth in a curve to that pandemic. And that had to do with typo squat domainings, or the global registration of domains that had something to do with COVID that were somehow related. This was directly correlated to an increase in phishing attempts, to an increase in ransomware. Now, what's going to be really amazing for you to understand is that in 2020, the most healthcare attacks were not a direct result of phishing. It actually was the result of external system vulnerabilities that malicious actors were able to gain quick access into networks through. And this came directly as a result of the transitions that were ongoing in how we were addressing our business. So these are the most common things that were occurring, the most common forms of attacks initially when COVID started, and the number of typo squats domains increased exponentially. Now, if we look at how breaches are occurring regionally, when we take a global perspective on this, and this is holistic across all industries right now, this is data from the data breach report from Verizon. Now, what's really interesting in this is the top patterns. In almost all cases across the regions, with the exception of LATAM, you see that web application weaknesses are the primary or the top pattern of attacks. And in most cases, when we look at the data that has been compromised by organizations, we see in all those indicators there that personal information and credentials rank up in the top two in almost all cases. So we do see slight variances of the type of attack techniques and whatnot, but in all cases, we see external attackers are making up the grand majority of those attacks within organizations. Now, we talked in the beginning about how long malicious actors will tend to sit in our network. Yes, we hear about these scary things like SolarWinds, where they've had access into the back doors in our organizations for over 6 months. However, the reality of the situation is the number of steps in an attack to get to a breach is usually less than 5. So here, this is again data from the Verizon Data Breach Report in 2020. There were 429 breaches examined. We saw that the majority are happening in 1 or 2 steps. So if you look there, these first 2 dots on the left side, that's essentially 250 of those 429. So that's 50% in about 2 steps. So very quick hit and run. And why is this? It is because the cost of running a cyber attack is becoming ever cheaper. So malicious actors can run toolkits, they can automate, they have the same tool sets that we as defensive actors in the industry have, and are able to automate their attacks as well. So what this means is that it becomes very cheap for them to go after a small component within your supply chain, find a way in there, create a backdoor, and figure out how to move laterally throughout your supply chain as time goes on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about how healthcare is compared to other industries and what we saw in this. And I'm going to give you just a brief introduction into security ratings. So there's a lot of different tools. There's a couple different tools out there right now in the space in security ratings. And so what security ratings tools do is they look at your external facing digital footprint, and they will score an organization across multiple domains of cybersecurity based on the severity of what they see, the quantity of issues that they see in relationship to the size of that external facing digital exposure. And so in the case of Security Scorecard, we look across 10 different domains. We're looking for things. What does the network security hygiene look like? How is the patching of organizations functioning? Are browsers and operating systems being updated regularly? How does the application security look? Do we have a lot of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities or content security policies missing that will make it easier for malicious actors to take advantage of those things? We'll look for malware signals to determine if organizations are emitting malware. So this is kind of the basic fundamental of what ratings tools do. In Security Scorecard, we rate companies on a 0 to 100 rating, and then we correlate that to a US grading system. For as an A is a 90 to 100, a B is 80 to 90, a C 70 to 80, and so forth. And what's very interesting is that our data over time has shown us that those companies that have C's, D's, or F's are 5 to 7 times more likely to experience breaches than those companies that have an A or a B. So we looked at 3 different groups. We looked at financial breach. We looked at breaches in the financial sector, and this is at a global scale. We looked at breaches in the healthcare sector. We looked at breaches in the retail sector, and then we looked at breaches holistically. So we looked at 1,687 breaches in our study. And here what you're looking at right now, and we're going to drill down into this in a moment, is you can see the score distribution. So you can see that in the overall breach list, 29% of those companies breach, in fact, had A's. However, 38% of them had C's, D's, or F's. So now when we compare the healthcare industry to the breach list as well as the other industries, we see that healthcare matches up to our control group extremely well, with 29% of those healthcare companies that experienced a breach in 2020 had quite strong scores. 36% had B's in facts. However, 34% fell into C, D's, and F's. And you can see that difference between a financial sector, where the financial sector scores were quite a bit higher. There was a lot less on the C's, D's, and F's. However, this also is explained in that they're much more regulatory driven. There's also, let's say, a lot of investment in cybersecurity comparatively, right? So it makes sense in terms of what we're seeing in the data here. Now, let's drill down into this a little bit more. Let's take the next step and determine where are the weaknesses in the various groups. So here what you're seeing is you're seeing now the percentage scores. So we've taken it down a level and we're looking across a couple of risk factors. So we looked across network security, we looked across DNS health, we looked across patching cadence, we looked across endpoint securities, whether those were being updated on a regular basis, and we looked across application security. So you can see the scores are pretty similar along the ways. But what was really interesting is that the 2 areas where healthcare scored the weakest was around patching and endpoint security. So 2 areas that were related to cyber hygiene and continuous patching of our, let's say, infrastructure or our external facing infrastructure. Now, when we compare this back to the data of where breaches occurred from, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, is that the majority of breaches did not come from phishing, but actually came from attacking the external facing digital footprint. And in that case, 33% of breaches were directly correlated to vulnerabilities in the external facing digital footprints. Little bit less than that, 30% were related to phishing. And the thinking of the professionals in the space is that there was less credential theft now in healthcare this year because actors, malicious actors, were able to more readily take advantage of those weaknesses in the changing infrastructure of these organizations, because we moved to remote work. We added in IoT devices and telehealth. So we started adding in new techniques and new infrastructure to reach our patients. And as a result, we also opened up new vulnerabilities. We can also see the overall scoring was again in line with the overall breach group. So this is really interesting how the data lined up quite nicely with what we're seeing where the breaches are coming from themselves. Now let's take this down into the next layer. So we're going to take this down into one layer. deeper. So we then looked across deeper issue levels. So security ratings tools will tend to look across tens of issues across these various disciplines, right? And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the count on average of issues that were detected in a healthcare organization, in a retail organization, or in a finance organization, reflectively, right? And so the ones that I highlighted in red are again where those averages of issues found in those entities are higher than those other breach peer groups. So for example, if we look at outdated browsers and outdated operating systems, we saw on average in healthcare companies that had been breached 12.6 findings of outdated web browsers. Compared to what we saw in retail and finance, that was about 8. So that's a good lift of, let's say, 50% there, increase or higher amount of findings on outdated web browsers. And the same thing is on outdated operating systems, where we saw 2 on average in the findings versus 1 and 1.6 compared to the financial sector and the retail sector. And again, when we look at services with high severity vulnerabilities, we saw 7 on average compared to 6 in retail, 6.7 in retail, and 3.4 in the finance sector. So again, this all lined up very nicely in terms of the data that we were seeing in the market space. So now what I'm going to walk into a little bit is, well, how do we go in and reduce this risk, especially when it comes to our supply chains? Supply chains are messy. Supply chains are complex. We have thousands of suppliers. In the healthcare space, I read alone that there are close to 800,000 companies working in the healthcare sector in the United States. So we can think that this is millions of companies worldwide, which are part of our ecosystems. And the common things that we hear when it comes to managing third-party risk are pretty normal. And first is, well, I don't have any time to think about strategy. We see that most organizations are underfunded when it goes to third-party risk. It's actually quite interesting to see in the healthcare industry the healthcare sector is that many teams that are responsible for vendor risk are 1, 2, 3 people. They're not extensive teams. If you take a financial or a bank, they may have teams up to 50 and 60 people in some cases working around vendor risk. So it's definitely an underfunded area and an under-resourced area. The second big challenge we hear organizations talk about is, well, how do I continuously monitor? How do I engage with vendors if I'm concerned about the cyber risk that they're bringing to my organization? And how do I create, let's say, an ongoing continuous policy, right? So the first thing that we looked at especially when COVID hit, is we had to evaluate our supply chains. And what was really interesting when we spoke to customers is the first thing they were concerned about at the beginning of the epidemic was about the solvency of their suppliers. They had to start thinking of plan Bs. We saw those degrees of separation, they're quite low. How do I have those plan Bs in place and plan Cs even if one of my suppliers is going to go out of business? So the first thing we saw organizations do were determine what type of changes might have been required to the vendor and supply chain risk process. The second step that they took is they went into their supply chain and their vendors and they identified where the concentration risks are. So what type of technologies are we very dependent on that if they were breached would potentially impact the operationalizing of our ongoing business? Really interesting story to this is I spoke to one of our colleagues in the energy sector, and they indicated that if certain suppliers would go down in the critical suppliers sector, it could cost them up to $100 million a day. So again, getting that grip on concentration risk is really important. The third part is understanding the financial situation of your vendors, mapping that back. We do see correlations to those organizations that are in financial distress very closely, in many cases connected back to higher risk on cybersecurity side. The fourth step was to go in and create that contingency plan. How do you build that resilience out in your planning of having other suppliers on hand should be needed? And then the fifth part was about how we're going to communicate with those vendors and engage with them. And this is really where most organizations spend the most of their time is how to do this effectively and how to automate as much as we can. So one of the things that we talk a lot about with our customers is about how to build that framework to take advantage of things like security ratings, but just overall engage with our vendors to reduce risk. So there's a couple of steps to this, and then we'll drill down really to a little bit more details on this. The first step is getting an understanding of what my ecosystem of my vendors looks like. We go into many organizations today and we see just having that overall list and having them tiered according to their business services or the impact to the business is often an area which is lacking and needs more focus. So this is really tiering and classification of vendors is really understanding. The third part is assessment, is really picking out what is the impact, right? So instead of looking at companies, we tend to often guide our customers to look at services, is what is the impact of a service going down, right? Looking at the cyber risk of a company from its security rating gives me a probabilistic insight of a likelihood of a breach of that company, but I want to go dig down a little bit more and understand what services that I'm using are dependent on this vendor that I may be working with. The fourth component of this is around collaboration. We see in terms of operationalizing security ratings, this is really where the brunt of time is being spent, is how to engage those vendors, invite them into a dialogue about cyber risk, how we link this back into contract discussions, which would be an extremely important topic in the healthcare industry. And we'll talk about that in a second. From there, it's developing that joint plan of how to mitigate risk, right? So security ratings tools may see thousands of issues. How do I take an actionable insight of what's really important in terms of the risks that I'm concerned with, or getting them to a scoring level which we feel comfortable doing business with? And then being able to report and go on and integrate this into our overall framework of systems. Now, one of the approaches that we take when we're entering into this is we want to decrease the attack surface for malicious actors. It's really about removing low-hanging fruits, right? So the first thing when we look at our vendor landscape, and once we've gotten control and we have an understanding of our process, is we want to get an understanding of the assets that we're discussing. So we have vendors look at their assets to determine what their exposure is and to make sure all those assets belong to them. We see a lot of park domains sitting out there that are exposed, not doing anything. Again, risk there. And then what we want to do is eliminate low-hanging fruits, eliminating databases that are exposed to the internet, getting rid of RDP ports. There's really no good reasons for RDP ports to be exposed. Looking for SMB vulnerabilities. On the DNS health, we want to clean up things like missing SPF records. We want to look at that correlation between typo squatting. So we see a correlation between those missing SPF records in organizations very frequently and the amount of typo squatting that is occurring at the same time. In terms of patching cadence gives us one of the best insights as to the cyber governance discipline of an organization. If we see a lot of high severity vulnerabilities, medium severity vulnerabilities in the last observations that are outstanding, this gives us a very good indication of the level of risks. On the application security level, we're looking at things like content security policies and cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that malicious actors will tend to take advantage of. And then endpoint security, we now have to look at more carefully, more than ever, where we have a lot more people working remotely. We have people inside our own organizations. We want to make sure that's all patched. But again, the remote worker aspect of this. So it's really about decreasing attack surface, not only for our own organizations, but also for that of our landscape. So what security ratings help organizations do in this grand scheme things is, first, we help organizations at scale understand the cyber risk of themselves and their key partners in a non-intrusive way. And that's really what's important here, is I need to quickly ascertain what is the risk, be able to engage with that vendor, act together to mitigate that risk that I'm concerned about, as well as benchmark that accordingly. Now, at the same time, security ratings will allow us to continuously monitor this. It allows us to look at our supply chains on an ongoing basis at a holistic level, understand where that risk is sitting, compare that to how the tiering in terms of the criticality of our services, and take action accordingly. But most importantly, as we see organizations are held very tightly in terms of their resources, we see that it helps us scale. So these are really the three things, regardless of what security ratings tool you might be looking at or considering. These are really the three wins that you would get out of security ratings when applying this into your supply chain. Now, how do we see the healthcare industry itself applying security ratings? It's really interesting is that the healthcare industry has been, I would say, applicable to all use cases that we've seen security ratings involved in. First, in the pharma sector, and I'll just give a couple examples and stories here as we're getting close to the end of time, is one is on vulnerability management of their own perimeter. So we see several pharma companies that are using security ratings to monitor their own external facing digital footprint of themselves and their subsidiaries, and then working with their teams to mitigate those risks and decrease that attack surface. In the vendor risk area, we see multiple use cases. We see first one-time spot checks for vendor onboarding. We see it for benchmarking in the RFP process if I'm looking at vendors and comparing who might I take a service from. We see it for continuous monitoring of critical vendors and integrating that into GRC services. We see hospitals using security ratings to manage the overall cyber risk reputation of those hospital chains along the way. We see distribution organizations and wholesalers in the healthcare industry using that to de-risk the supply chain. We see health insurance organizations continuously monitoring their critical suppliers to manage the privacy. They're very impacted by managing that privacy. I think one of the more exciting use cases, which we're starting to see scaling out, is how do we bring in clinical trials into using cyber ratings? If we think about clinical trials that go on, those go into small doctors and medical facilities here and there, and they may have a very small web presence, but they're actually handling extremely critical data. And it's very important to be able to, at scale, when we have thousands of doctors involved in critical let's say these type of clinical trials, is to be able to assess what that cyber risk is along the way. So healthcare has really been able to take advantage of security ratings. To summarize the key takeaways, things that I really hope that you've been able to pull out of the last 30 minutes is that inside the healthcare sector, the dynamicism of transformation has been tremendous. And part of what we should be looking into as part of that process is how do we reduce that attack surface? And as we're developing things more aggressively, how do we minimize that risk there? IoT, we're going to see grow in importance. What's really interesting in healthcare is that IoT is actually one of the few areas where healthcare is managing their own security. In many cases, that security is outsourced. So it's going to be interesting to see if that IoT security experience that we're taking is going to shift its way back internally into organization. The second part is that attack vectors in the healthcare industry have been predictable. When we compared that data, when we went into that study a moment ago, we see where the weak points are, where we can improve to decrease that overall risk. We've seen that with this digital transformation ongoing, we're more exposed and have to be more focused on that. And then the final piece and the final takeaway is the protected healthcare information is really the prize. And eliminating that low-hanging fruit really decreases the attack surface. We see it in the data across 8 years in the security ratings industry that those companies that have C's, D's, or F's are 5 to 7 times more likely to experience a breach along the way. With that in mind, I'd like to thank you for your attention over the last 30 minutes and pass it back to David.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Very interesting insights. And from what we were able to see, there's still a lot to be said about security ratings. And this is probably a very, very interesting topic for upcoming initiatives from our side.